So we're going to start with Arturo, and then we'll go to our other two speakers, which fortunately have already been introduced to. We're going to talk about, besides talking about you once you're gone, we're going to talk about the genesis, development, and continuing relevance of Latino politics itself. Henry made a point. He used the word that Harry was present at the creation. He happens to have anticipated one of the points that I made with Roberto. There was once a memoir written called Present at the Creation, and the response to that was a memoir about the creation of the post-war world. One of the responses was, that's too modest. It was written by one of the creators. Harry was one of the creators of Latino politics and Latino policy studies as we know it today. And Arturo, having served at the National Council of La Raza and at MALDEF, knows what it was before. Those are organizations that were started as Mexican-American organizations that then became Latino. Whereas NALEO and the Congressional Hispanic Caucus were started as Latino organizations from the beginning. And it's that creation and development over time that I'm going to ask our speakers to address. And also another thing that was addressed in the video in particular. Harry invented an important technique of Latino empowerment, which is this workshop model of naturalization promotion, promoting citizenship. And I'd like, if you can, Arturo, in the couple of minutes that you can give us, talk to us about the development and future of Latino politics and what you've done with that workshop model that Harry invented in the time that you've been heading NALEO.
Thank you, David. Because there is nothing more political or central to the political development of Latinos to ensure that Latino voters have a fair opportunity to elect representatives of their choice, and that's exactly what redistricting is about. So I'm about to rush off to San Fernando Valley and be crucified. But that's exactly why we do the work we do. We don't do it because we want to be popular or because we want accolades, but we do it because we need to move our community forward. And that's exactly the work that Dr. Pachon did, and has been an honor and a privilege for me to follow in his footsteps at NALEO and to continue his vision of how do you move forward the Latino community and develop true political power among this group that he knew, and Mr. Roybal as well understood, were the future of the United States. But they also understood that there was a major handicap that Latinos experienced when it came to participation in the political process, was that our voice was nowhere near our presence in the population. And even with the most recent census showing that we are 50.5 million Latinos in the United States, not counting the Latinos in the territory of Puerto Rico, that we only project at NALEO that 12.5 million will vote in November of this year. So why is that disparity between the size of our population and then the much smaller size of our electorate? Much of it has to do with demographics, and Harry and Mr. Roybal knew this. We're a very young population, much lower median age than non-Latinos. So simply many can't vote because they're not old enough. They'll just come with time. But they also understood that there was a large segment of the adult Latino population that were not yet citizens. And that continues to this day. Harry and Mr. Roybal saw in IRCA, the 1986 immigration reform law, the opportunity to convert Latino immigrants into Latino voters. And so NALEO at that time played a critical role in helping to convince millions of Latino undocumented immigrants at the time to come out of the shadows and to trust the federal government that they could come forward and legalize their status. That was step number one. Step number two was, once they achieved legal permanent residency, then to take the next step and to become a U.S. citizen. They understood that the only way to short circuit this thing that will come with time of children reaching the age of citizenship was to get this gold mine that we had and mined it and converting legal permanent residents into U.S. citizens. And so they developed this workshop model that was a one-stop shop where an immigrant that was citizenship ready could come in and walk out having filed for citizenship, and hopefully within 9 months, at one point it was as long as 3 years, become a United States citizen. And this issue is very close to my heart, not just because, this is what I get paid to pay my mortgage with, but because in 1993, I came home from work one day when I was at Maldiv, and my mother announced that she had just come back from a NALEO Educational Fund Citizenship Workshop at the elementary school down the street. And that she, after having been a legal permanent resident since 1952, had decided that finally she had had enough demagoguery against immigrants, and that she wanted to become a United States citizen. And it was by going to a NALEO citizenship workshop that she filled out her application, and about a year later, took the oath and became a United States citizen, and voted for the first time in November of 1994, and has not missed an election since. And I know that Dice Aguilar is here, our friend with one of our most important corporate partners here in Los Angeles, and I know this story because her father, it was your father, right? Went through the same process of becoming a U.S. citizen because of the campaigns that NALEO have been doing over the years. So Harry and Dr. Pachon and Mr. Roybal understood that in order to achieve true political power, we really needed to expand the Latino vote. So citizenship became key to that. But they also knew that the whole notion of bringing together Latino political leaders, elected and appointed officials, having them support each other was absolutely critical to achieving a true voice in public policy, providing the information, the resources, and the support to do that. I just feel honored and privileged to be able to continue in that trajectory, and I hope that the work that NALEO has done since Harry left the mantle of being executive director in 1993 is a tribute to his work and his legacy. Thank you again to the Pachon family for letting us borrow him so many hours away from being with you so that he could be with us and move the community forward. Thank you.
Okay, we can relax only a little bit because we're trying to make up some time. We're falling a little bit behind on schedule. Let me just mention, my name is David Ayon. I'm at Loyola Marymount University. It's another one of the institutions that Harry passed through and made his mark and influenced a lot of people at. And of course, you've already been introduced to our two speakers on this panel. I'm going to ask them each to address this question of the emergence and the development of Latino politics. And just to be clear, because we have, for the most part, talked as if that was a natural thing. Whereas, in fact, you could almost say that before Harry Pachon and Ed Roybal created such things as the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and NALEO, you didn't really have Latino politics as we know it today. You had separate Latin American origin communities, Mexican Americans in the Southwest, Puerto Ricans, mainly in the Northeast in the New York area, Cuban Americans in Florida, and others like Harry, who happens to be of Colombian origin, all over the country. And they weren't really integrated into any sort of a common project, a common agenda. And here we have a couple of excellent speakers who can address how that came about, the challenges that were involved in bringing that about, and where we are today. I'd like to start with Luis DeSipio, who is chair of Chicano Latino Studies at UC Irvine. As Rudy de la Garza said, was a key collaborator of Harry's, and in many ways is a key successor on the academic side in terms of policy research, about the role that policy research played in the creation of a Latino politics, of a Latino project, and of a Latino agenda.
Oh, thank you, David, and thanks to the family who I've known at various stages for many, many years. And had the pleasure of, I think, babysitting Mark at one point, though I'm not sure that he acknowledged that was what I was there for. Harry's work really, I think, embodies the building of this agenda. If you think about the kinds of questions that Harry's asked in his research over the last 30 years, he's looked at Latino candidates for elective office. He's looked at barriers to achieving elective office for Latinos. He's looked at employment of Latinos in the public bureaucracy. He's looked at representations of Latinos in the media. He's looked at remittance patterns and transnational engagement among Latinos. He's looked at intergroup relations between Blacks, Latinos, Asian Americans, Native Americans. He's looked at the delivery of goods and services in Latino communities. He's talked about educational access and access to college. Note that I haven't even mentioned his work in naturalization and political empowerment here, which of course were central to what Harry did. Each of these issues were critical to encouraging Latinos of various national origins to recognize what they shared in common, and that what they shared in common was greater than some of the differences between different cultural practices, different immigration histories, different histories in the United States. So Harry's work and the work that he encouraged through staff at the various organizations guaranteed that there would be the foundation for Latinos to be thinking about a common agenda, in addition to the issues that different national origin communities or different groups in the United States might share individually. I think as importantly, Harry built institutions to ensure that these questions of a common Latino agenda would be front and center in policymakers' eyes, in the academy's eyes, and in the public's eyes through the media. So NALEO, TRPI, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, each of those ensured that there would be a place where people would look at what Latino communities shared and how to get better information about each of those issues. I think a final piece to answer David's question is that Harry really pioneered doing good survey work in Latino communities. A number of people here, Rudy, participated in very early surveys of Latinos. They were phenomenally expensive. Their value was questioned, but Harry, particularly through TRPI, found a way that surveys could be done relatively inexpensively and accurately so that we would know what Latinos thought about various issues in a way that we simply couldn't have before he became involved in some of these questions.
Thank you very much, Louis. We're extremely fortunate, of course, to have Henry Cisneros here, who needs no introduction, the premier Latino political leader on the national stage, and a leader in the private sector and in many other areas as well. Another one of the creators of a Latino political project, of a Latino political presence on the national level. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that prior to the sort of institutional changes that occurred in the 1970s and the creation of NALEO and the creation of the CHC, there hadn't been a Latino in the cabinet. I don't think that happens until the Reagan administration in '81. So why don't you talk to us about the challenges? You were a founder of the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. The challenges of fashioning this agenda from the point of view of political leadership and the results that you get from that in impressing that upon the political parties, upon administrations, and actually succeeding in getting at the table and being a part of policy discussions.
Well, David, thank you, and thank you, first of all, for your good work over a lot of years academically and in the civic community. David is presently co-chair of something called the Mexican-American Leadership Institute, MALI, which is part of a larger U.S.-Mexico Foundation, which is attempting to do civic engagement in which American Latinos relate to Mexico in a way that we have never been able to do, and which is more critical now than ever with the almost dissolution of civic dialogue in Mexico. So David, thank you for all that you have done over so many years, and Monica, you, the dynamic duo that the two of you are in this city. I too want to express my respect to the family, Barbara and the family, and express my appreciation to Dean Knott and Roberto Sudo on behalf of those of us who were friends and admirers of Harry for making an afternoon like this possible. Of all of the ways to pay tribute to a person, to have an academic symposium on these subjects seems to me just about exactly right as the way, and Harry would, I'm sure he's listening in very carefully are saying this afternoon. So to answer your question, David, it is true that prior to sort of galvanizing efforts like NALEO, organizing, unifying efforts, that the Latino political momentum was pretty splintered across the country. I have often said that, you know, we tout the size of the Latino community, and we've been doing that for some time. I remember when it was 25 million, 30 million, 35 million, now it's 50 million, as if it was a cohesive force. But it really was, you know, hundreds of warring tribes, you know, all across America, splintered by geography, Californians, Texans, New Mexicans, Floridians, New Yorkers, Chicagoans, by ideology, conservatives and liberals, Republicans and Democrats, by national origin, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Mexicanos, Central Americans, people from South America, the Caribbean, and every other possible, you know, religious and other splits that you can impose upon that mass. And the ability to credibly articulate that we are a national force requires at least some venues in which people can come together, right, and talk about a common agenda. So in the 80s and in the 90s, serious efforts began to bring people together. Now, Leo was one of those. So was the National Hispanic Leadership Agenda. And the byword was, look, let's talk about the things we can agree on and agree to disagree about some other things. We're never going to agree, Puerto Ricans in New York City, progressive Chicanos in LA, and conservative Cubans in Miami about how to deal with Cuba. We're not going to get there, right? And there are other subjects like that we're not going to get there on, right? But we found amazing consensus on things like bilingual education. The most conservative Cubans, they revel in quality Spanish. They speak Spanish better than most of us Mexicanos do, into multiple generations. We can agree on the importance of things like small business strategies, because we're entrepreneurs and our small business people need the contracting assistance and small business assistance, even though when it was, you know, conservative ideology to do away with affirmative action. Not in our community, because our people are still coming on. They need help, etc. So there was a lot of things we'd agree upon, but we needed the structures, the venues, the gathering places where those conversations could occur. And I think Harry understood that, and Leo played a very, very important role. Harry's role, I think, was multiple. As I said earlier, it was institutional. You have to create the organizations, right? It was brilliant in the sense of the projects. For example, the talleres that were described with respect to immigration. But I would say that in my mind, looking back on it, Harry's greatest attribute, greatest virtue, greatest contribution was just a rock-solid, unshakable belief in the trajectory of our community, and a belief that we need to keep working and trying and taking one step after another, even in times of setbacks and disappointments. He was like another person of his contemporary who also died too early, a man named Willie Velasquez, who created the Southwest Voter Registration Project, who believed in a very simple concept. Su voto es su voz. Vote, you have a voice. In America, to have a say in the trajectory of our country, you have to exercise your vote. And Harry's belief was very much like Willie's in the sense that it was a simple idea. The concept is clear, pure, right? But not everybody can stay the course for a lifetime. Not everybody can articulate it and march down that path, you know? I think the great ones, like Harry, like Willie, like Cesar Chavez and others, are people who, you know, have the stamina to stay the course, and that was Harry's contribution.
Thanks very much on that. Let's go back to it's already been brought up, and it's a signature innovation and contribution that one of the institutions that Harry co-founded, NALEO, has developed, and that was the approach to promoting naturalization, to promoting citizenship, starting with more than a kernel, more than a seed, a technique, the workshop model that was developed in the 1980s that allowed, as Arturo was mentioning before he left, unfortunately he's not going to be able to address this, but fortunately I think both of our panelists can. That workshop model then took on a whole other life in succeeding years. You devised, ultimately culminating in a campaign called Ya es Hora, not just the promotion of citizenship, but also the promotion in participation in the census and in voter participation. A multi-stage, national, branded campaign for integrating Latinos, and in particular immigrants, but all Latinos, into American society and into American politics. And I'd like to hear from each of you, from your own perspectives. Luis, you looked at what NALEO was doing in citizenship promotion going way back to the 1980s. And you, in fact, thought this is what needed to happen, was mobilize naturalization on a national scale. How did that happen? And then I'd like to have Henry address how other actors participated in this, such as Spanish language media and the private sector.
You know, I think the naturalization campaign is a perfect example of Harry's vision. The Talleres came 3 or 4 years into the project, and it began with good social science research. Harry knew that we needed to be able to prove to the nation and to the funding community that there was demand for naturalization services. So the first steps in the project, you know, were anonymous to people. He went back and looked at existing scholarship to see what previous scholars had said about who naturalizes and why. He commissioned some of the best social scientists doing work on Latino communities in that era to reanalyze some existing data. We did small projects in different communities to see, you know, why there might be regional variations on outcomes of naturalization. In some places, there were relatively high rates of naturalization, and in some places, Denver, I remember, very low rates, and you know why that was happening. So there was a foundation, and with that foundation, he was able to then go out to funders and say, look, if you give us some money, we will get a payoff for that. I worked for NALEO in this era, and we got some very small amounts of money from the Ford Foundation to run an 800 number. This was, you know, before the cell phone era, when you had to provide for people the ability to call you long distance for free. And, you know, we didn't know what to budget it at, so, you know, we figured, well, we'll probably be busy about 20 hours a week, you know, so we did some back of the envelope kind of calculations. The 800 number was opened with one press conference in Los Angeles, not a particularly big one if I remember correctly. By about 2 days later, we got a call from AT&T that was providing the service saying that we were shutting down their circuits. There was so much demand on this single number. Well, it exceeded our budget estimates also. This was another problem. But based on that, you know, we were able to then merge the social science research with the empirical evidence, breaking down AT&T's circuits, to then build other ways of delivering information to people that desperately wanted information. And with various failed experiments, certainly the Talleres model proved successful. You could provide a lot of information to most people and then pull off the ones that had specific problems and have for them professionals, lawyers, or paralegals that could work them through the problems that they had. So anyway, you know, the example that Arturo offered of his mother, you know, I think is representative of literally tens of thousands of people who would not have been citizens, or certainly not have been citizens as quickly, without sort of Harry's insights into the way that you merge good social science research with practical evidence to leverage resources. Now the dilemma, and this gets to the other half of David's question, is these resources can be provided in large number, in high volume for a while, but unfortunately over time, demand starts to atrophy a little bit and resources atrophy probably quicker than demand. So we need a way to sort of sustain that evidence of high demand for naturalization, because I double-checked this morning, there's still about 12 million unnaturalized Latinos in the United States. So the numbers remain. Some share of those are not eligible, certainly, but a healthy estimate would be 4 or 5 million who are eligible. So there's still the demand out there. We need a way to reach this generation, just as Harry reached the generation in the 1980s and 1990s.
Thanks. Among the many hats that you've worn, Henry, of leadership, you were president of a national network, of the Univision network. Talk to us about how this cause of promoting Latino and in particular immigrant integration into American society and into the American political system in such a thing as the Ya Es Hora campaign brought together the private sector, at least in the form of media companies, both print and broadcast, unions, Latino organizations, elected officials. How did all of this come about?
Well, let me say first that when Naleo first advanced the idea of involvement in naturalization and citizenship, it wasn't clear why. That is to say, this was an organization that was created to support Latino office holders, right? And appointed persons and promote that notion. But obviously, when you think about it a little bit, we're not going to advance in terms of the numbers without dramatically improving the number of people who are who become citizens, right? And we had huge numbers of people who were here in the country, eligible to be citizens, but for whatever reasons, did not. And there were lots of reasons why people chose not to be. Some intended to still maybe go back. Others, like my grandfather who came in 1926 and died in 1975 at 93 years of age and never became a citizen, because he believed that you had to, in taking the oath of allegiance to the United States, reject all loyalties to any other country, and he could not bring himself to do that to his beloved homeland of Mexico. So he never became a citizen. Sent 5 sons to the United States military in World War II, but himself never became a citizen. And there was that sort of mythology that built up in our community, and multiple other reasons why people didn't become citizens. Well, Harry understood that we were not going to make great progress on the central agenda of Naleo, which is creating more decision makers to influence the direction of the country without dealing with citizenship. And so we've made great progress in the years since. I think Latino politics is very robust, in my opinion. It's not what it ought to be, and it's not what it will be, but, I mean, we've elected the mayor of Los Angeles. We've elected mayors like Angel Tavares in Providence. We've elected every office holder in Miami, from mayors to county leaders. Julian Castro is a future national star out of San Antonio now, and on and on and on across the country. The congressional caucus is, I mean, it used to be 10 or 12 people about the time Naleo was formed. I think it's exceeding 30 or so now, or will, with the seats that come out of redistricting, and on and on and on. At the incubator stages of county commissioner, city council member, school board member, the 6,000 number we were discussing earlier. And my sense is that more and more Latinos are participating. Now, there's a lot of evidence to the contrary. Our voting numbers are not what they ought to be, but in some elections where people are really excited, they break records. Whether it's a local election where you have a personality that people want to vote for, or even the national election in 2008, where you could argue that President Obama won Nevada and New Mexico and Florida and Virginia. The margin of difference was the size of the Latino vote, the larger Latino vote than usual, right? So my own sense is very optimistic about where this goes, but it's clear we've got to do a better job of breaking down the reasons why people don't become citizens or why people don't vote. And this is, I think, understood well by everyone who cares about fairness in redistricting, fairness in allocation of public resources, CDBG money and every other kind of federal guideline, the census, and every other place where numbers count. And hence, labor unions, political leaders, church leaders, and Latino media have weighed in. Univision has put massive resources, along with Naleo, and very proud of it, a working relationship, completely joined together, put tens of millions of dollars of airtime into the Ayasora campaign to penetrate people's consciousness about the importance of these questions. The next agenda in which this collaboration will bear fruit is in education, impressing the importance of education, impressing on families, the culture, the ethic of education within families, etc. So for all of these reasons, I mean, everyone who cares, and then I'll close just by saying, any right-thinking person who cares about the future of this country who cares about the development of the next middle class, who cares about the person power that's going to be needed to staff the critical institutions of America, must be for bringing Latinos into the mainstream of American society through citizenship, through education, through improving incomes. Because unlike other countries, Japan, France, Spain, Germany, the Low Countries in Europe that are declining in population or stable, the United States is still growing. It's a hugely important advantage that we have. And the reason that we're growing is because of our immigrant populations and principally our Latino populations. The question is not whether we're going to grow. It's whether we're going to empower people, provide them incomes, provide them educations, and provide the fuel that drives this country forward. So, David, I hope that somewhere in there I answered your question.
I'm gonna ask the panelists one more question to wrap this up, and then maybe we'll have time for a couple of questions from the audience before we have to move on. This session has been about naturalization and about political participation, incorporation into American society and politics. But it's amazing how much this Latino approach, this Latino strategy that Harry was such a fundamental part of creating in politics has proliferated throughout American society. In almost every institution, I once tried to do an inventory of the various sorts of Hispanic and Latino associations in just about every profession, maybe every profession there is. There's one that I missed. I was at a panel last fall in the Bay Area, and after it was over, a woman introduced herself and gave me her card. She's the head of the Latina Golfers Association. I hadn't heard of that one before. That struck me. We have an interesting pair of current trends, and I'd like you both to address where we are now and where we're going. Henry just talked about the robustness of a Latino agenda. I'd like you to address how current trends, two that are sort of ironically paired today, might affect the unity, the cohesiveness of a Latino agenda going forward, and the use of techniques, these sort of campaign techniques such as we've seen in Yasora going forward. And those two trends are this, and they're going to get into it much more on the panel, I think, on demographic trends next, but we're going to step a little bit on their toes. One is that demographically we're shifting from an era in which it appears that population growth due to immigration peaked already, and it's passed. And it is steadily being displaced, overwhelmed even, by natural increase due to US-born Latinos. What does this imply for, what does this mean for a Latino agenda? Does this mean greater unity because people are more referring to the reality of the country they were born in and live in, and not the country that their parents and grandparents came from, or something else? But the irony is that this shift away from increase due to immigration to the US born is paired in our time to a great extended new historical era of anti-immigrant hostility and repatriation pressures, such as we've seen in decades in the past, but it has really come back in the last few years with a vengeance. So this new generations of US-born Latinos are growing up in this sort of a climate. So I'd like, starting with Louis, how do you see these trends, a shift demographically towards the US-born, at the time of enhanced repatriation pressures and anti-immigrant hostility, affecting the coherence of a Latino agenda going forward, and the sort of techniques that will be used for Latino integration going forward?
Well, I mean, just sort of a simple demographic point that I know will be echoed in the next panel, that for voting at least, the immigrant generation is going to be the dominant one for a while, just because it takes a while for today's native-born children to age into political eligibility at 18, but likely political behavior at 30 or so. You know, so that we have time to sort of anticipate this. But my sort of take on the sort of growing anti-immigrant fervor in the United States will actually will serve to reinforce a national Latino identity. And it will encourage Latinos to be thinking about sort of who their coalition partners are in American society in a way that they probably wouldn't have thought about that question maybe at the beginning of Harry's career in the 1970s and 1980s. You know, over that same period where you know, a large immigrant population is now slowly being replaced by a larger number of native-born Latinos, you've seen a shift in non-Hispanic populations. You've seen declining birth rates in those populations. You've seen an aging in that, particularly in the non-Hispanic white population, and you've seen a greater political division in that population, such that Latinos have the opportunity to influence the election in Virginia or North Carolina or Indiana, you know, places that we really wouldn't have anticipated Latino influence. But that argument can be made in 2008 because non-Latinos were so evenly divided, and that gave the Latino community an opportunity to have its voice heard maybe ahead of where we would have expected. So the second generation and third generation that is coming of age in this era of painting all Latinos with a single brush will have the not surprising effect of encouraging commonalities to be seen where in the past differences might have been seen. I think one question though that we need to ask if we're looking to the longer term future, and this is a failing in my work, and I really think the work of all people who study Latino politics, is that we begin our studies often with the question, are you Latino? And if somebody says no to that question on a survey or in a face-to-face kind of interview, we sort of lose interest in that person. Where increasingly, as the native-born come to dominate the Latino adult population and the third generation takes a bigger role, we have people who are more situationally Latino. And we shouldn't forget that population as it becomes a bigger share of the story that we want to tell, to understand what's truly happening with the Latino population. So, you know, I think, you know, we're not looking to the 2012 or 2016 election, which is, you know, what many political scientists are doing, but really looking to, you know, 2032 or 2036. I think the questions we have to ask is sort of what are the triggers and resources in American society that will encourage the maintenance and deepening of a Latino identity, and what are the sort of assimilative influences that will break down that identity over time. And I don't have an answer, I just sort of want to keep that in the question as we're thinking about native-born populations coming to dominate the Latino political population.
David, I think I'd say two things. The first is that, at least in my sense, the virulence, the anger is not, it's called anti-immigrant, but it's not really anti-immigrant. It's anti-change, it's anti-new faces, it's anti-cultural shifts in the American milieu. And that in due course, that will crest and begin to fade, because this is a country that is pretty amazing. I mean, who would have thought we would elect an African-American president in 2008? Who would have thought that a biracial man would become president of the United States? I mean, the dominant trends of the future are intermarriage, biracial makeup, new people coming to leadership in highly visible ways, which, you know, in time gets people used to the idea of the change. Multi-racial mixes in populations, with Asian Americans playing a critical role in key cities, along with Latinos and African Americans, and people coming from other parts of the world. It's a pretty amazing place, and I think in due course that some of the virulence will crest. But in the short run, it will become, the fever will become higher, because people are holding on to the last vestiges of an earlier vision. We see that in Texas very dramatically. In fact, people have said to me privately, we got to hold on as long as we can, because we know when this changes, we've lost it completely and it's not coming back, because the country is going to change fundamentally. So people are hanging on with every bit of ugliness that they can, using every tactic that they can, from redistricting to school budgets to voting down bond issues. To, it's going to be ugly for a while. And then I think, you know, it crests and we find a new post-racial American society. So that's, I think, one piece of what we're going to confront. How does it affect the Latino agenda? I don't think it does. The immigrant issue versus native born. I think that we have to have a self-determinant Latino agenda. That is to say, we need to know what we need for the well-being of the Latino community for the future. Education is probably number one on that list. There are other issues that are close to it, like political empowerment and economic progress. But our agenda meshes well with the national agenda. It's just that we have to be determined in a self-determinant kind of way. We have to know what our interest is, and we have to fight for it. And it's mostly about an aspirational agenda. And therefore, it doesn't matter whether we're talking about immigrants who integrate into the society or young children who are born within the country. You know, it's aspirational. It's building the future of Latinos in the United States. And for most practical purposes, it isn't changed by this demographic you described.
Roberto is allowing us to go just a few more minutes over. If there are a couple of pressing questions, we'd certainly like to hear them and have our panelists address them. Do I see anyone with a question for our panelists right now? Dean.
There have been some recent studies that have shown that intergenerational mobility in the U.S. is less than it used to be, and actually now less than in Europe. Do you feel that has any implications for the community, and if so, what might those be?
Did everyone hear the question? That's the study showing that intergenerational mobility is down. There is less intergenerational mobility in American society today, and he asked the panelists to address what that means for Latinos.
Well, anything that slows down the ability of poor people to move into the middle class and beyond is exceedingly damaging to the Latino future. And if it's damaging to the Latino future, it's damaging to the national future, because we no longer are a small part of the United States. We now register on every scale. You see, if Latinos don't perform well in school in California, then California is no longer in the front ranks of educational attainment. It drops dramatically because the Latino population is that much of a weight on the scales. So anything that slows down the movement to the middle class, whether it's declines in home ownership, whether it's lesser performance in school, whether it's budgets that affect school performance, whether it's accession to college, whether it's numbers of people who get technical degrees, anything that slows down the traditional access to the middle class, wage rates, falling union participation, anything that slows down the movement to the middle class is grievously damaging to the Latino community, and we need to fight against it. It's the American future is in some ways sort of right before our eyes. If you believe the middle class is fragile and threatened, if you believe that kind of lesser union participation means less ability to fight for good wages, if you believe that good jobs are being offshored and services jobs are left, if you believe all of those things, then there's great reason to be worried about a society that is bifurcated into a small number of those who have and a large number of those who are going to be left at the bottom rungs. That is not the vision of the United States we want. That is not the vision that's driven the growth of the middle class since World War II. And I mean, in some sense, that's what the president spoke about in the State of the Union last night, and what this next election is going to be about. So yes, Jack, those are absolutely key questions for a community that is aspiration, that has yet to get to the next plateau.
And certainly the recognition of those diminished opportunities is what's spurring some of the anti-immigrant, or I think Secretary Cisneros is right on, the anti-change rhetoric of those who are concerned about immigrant and Latino gains in the United States. And I think, bringing this back to Harry, this is why he created institutions, because it is those institutions that can speak to the failure of of the U.S. government, of state governments, of local governments to provide the resources that Latinos need and immigrants, poor people generally need to succeed in U.S. society. The opportunities that the previous generation of immigrants had are not necessarily being replicated now, and through good research, through good advocacy, we can make that point to larger audiences.
And on that note, we're going to make time for the next panel. So please join me in thanking our panelists.